We're going to look today, we've been going through the books of the Bible, and we come this morning to what are called the Pastoral Epistles. We all know what an epistle is, don't we? It's a female apostle. So the old ones are the best, aren't they? Never mind. And the Pastoral Epistles would be 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And they're bold together, and often people will say, well, these are the letters written to leaders, and the things that are in them concern leaders. But actually, it's a bit broader than that. But let's do a basic introduction before I scare you with where we're going to go this morning. But these letters are written to two young ministers. Timothy is a relatively young man, although reasonably inexperienced. Titus is an older gentleman, but again, relatively inexperienced in leadership. And they have become Paul's representatives to the churches. And Timothy at this time is based in Ephesus. We looked at Ephesians a few weeks ago. And Titus is based in Crete, Crete being one of a group of islands and a main trade route between Ephesus and Crete. Basically, they'd get loads of supplies from there. So it's no surprise to hear that similar issues happen in Crete in the church as they do in Ephesus. In fact, the book of Titus and the book of 2 Timothy generally repeat the information and the instructions given in 1 Timothy. And Paul writes to them about specific issues. These are some of the earliest letters that Paul actually wrote. We need to remember the church is young, it's immature, it's a new movement. Many people would remember even seeing Jesus physically walking the earth. It is that the church is new, and as a result of that, all sorts of things start to spring up within the churches. And so Paul feels he needs to write directly to Timothy and to Titus and give them certain instructions about how to run church, because actually no one had done it before. That makes sense. No one had actually ever done it before, so now we have this group of people finding their way in their faith and discovering that actually it can't just be a free-for-all. Now the interesting thing about Ephesus, where Timothy is that it consists mainly of house churches. We see that in 1 Timothy 2:18. You may not be able to follow every verse, and I won't mention every verse. But what I will probably do, if you're on Facebook, I will publish this sermon as notes for you in case you want to pick it up. Would that be helpful? If you're not on Facebook, we'll try and get it to you some other way. I was going to say print it, but that just sounds so old hat, doesn't it? Let's save the rainforests. But anyway, what we discover is they're mainly house churches. And actually, the issue that is pervading the church is not... We would tend to have the idea that one big church has a problem. But what it is, it's a big church, but it's spread across the city and the area in Crete. And so it's made up of smaller groups, probably in groups of 15 to 30 people. Now, how many of you know that in a group of 15 to 30 people, it's easier to have influence than in a group of 300 or 400 people? Isn't it? That makes sense. We know what that's like. If you're a part of a life group, you know that you've developed friendships and relationships within a life group, and it's easier to have your voice heard, isn't it? That makes sense. So we understand that's what's going on here. But what is actually happening is that some of them are being moved outside of the Christian teaching that Paul would want to have. And he addresses that to Titus. And so we begin to discover that something is happening across small groups within a church and across small groups of a church, a wider body, and so it's leading to all sorts of problems. Now, I want to issue a health warning, if that's okay. I'm going to open a can of worms today. Is that all right? Have we got any cans of worms? We've got some noodles. I guess that's not saying noodles or worms. Got some beans, some dried vegetable soup. And over on Mike's little pile here, who was Billy No Mates this morning, as everyone rushed to Penny, we have some baked beans. Lord bless you. That's not for him. I'm going to open a can of worms this morning, and the reason it is, one of the challenges of leadership is not to make our preaching so sweet that we avoid difficult scriptures. And one of the advantages of going through a book and going through the Bible as a whole and giving an overview is occasionally we come across verses that are difficult. And I did say the other week, I'm not very good at brushing things under the carpet, so I'd rather not. Is that all right? So this morning, for some of you, I'm going to upset you. For some of you, I'm going to bring clarity where there's confusion. And for others, you're going to say, I didn't know this was an issue in the first place. And that's fine. Okay? That's all right if that's where we are. But at the end of this, we will understand certainly where I think I stand on certain situations, but also where the Elim movement and therefore we as a local church stand. Because there's lots of things going on here. And you're all wondering, what on earth is he about to say to us? Well, the one big issue is this within Ephesians. What is being taught? What is actually coming out in church services? There is actually an error that is being promoted. Now, if you want to open your Bibles, you can do it 1 Timothy chapter 2, because that's where we're going to spend a lot of our message. But before we get to 1 Timothy, Paul actually, in the book of Acts, in chapter 20, calls for the elders of Ephesus to come and meet with him. And so they sit at Ephesus and they have a discussion. I just want to give you, I'm not going to go through a whole discussion. I certainly don't have time for that. But I just want to read a few things that Paul says to them. In Acts chapter 20, verse 30, talking to the leaders of the church, he says this, even from your own number, men will arise and distort the truth in order to draw away disciples after them. So he is warning them that false teaching has arisen in the church, and it hasn't come from outside particularly, it's come from inside the church, which is interesting, isn't it? And it's come from men. Ooh, didn't expect that one. Paul continues in verse 31 of Acts 20, remember that for 3 years I've never stopped warning each of you night and day with tears. So this is not a new thing in terms of the life of the church. It's been there virtually since the beginning of the church. And Paul is saying, I've pleaded with you, I've cried with you, I've wept with you, and still you won't listen. Men, what is wrong with you? You won't pay attention to what's being said. In fact, if we go to 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 and verse 7, we discover that the church is being led astray, and it's being led astray even by some of the teachers there. He writes to Timothy and he says, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain men not to teach certain doctrines any longer. They want to be teachers of the law, but they don't know what they're talking about or what they so confidently affirm. So what we have here is a group of men in the church who are teaching certain things that are error and false and shouldn't be taught in the first place. And Paul is very straight with them and says to Timothy, they don't even know what they're talking about. Isn't that interesting? Hopefully that doesn't apply to this morning. Well, that might be a matter of opinion. But actually, we begin to discover that there is a problem here. Teaching is an important role within the church. You don't have to turn here, but in chapter 1 and chapter 6 and verse 30 of 1 Timothy, we read, the elders who direct the affairs of the church well, those who direct the affairs of the church well, are worthy of double honor, especially those who is preaching and teaching. However, it seems that some had risen up in the church and saw an opportunity to exploit others. In Titus 1 verse 11, this is all introduction to where we're going. In Titus 1 verse 11, we read, they must be silenced because they're ruining whole households by teaching things they ought not to teach, and that for the sake of dishonest gain.